Have you ever taken the time to wonder if the climate protests work? Like, do they actually make a difference? Have people change their minds once they saw these protests go on and say, hey, you know what? They have something here. Maybe we should discuss this more, or maybe we should support organizations that are supporting climate change in terms of reducing climate change. That's a question I had. And if you want to know that same question, you're going to find out today because we have Alex de Koning from Just Stop Oil on the program today to talk about climate activism, the protest from Just Stop Oil, and how effective it is and what their purpose is. You've probably seen them in a ton of videos, including protests on an F1 racing track while the race was going on, walking slowly in traffic in rush hour traffic, as well as spilling paint on paintings in museums, all in the name of reducing climate change and making sure that the UK government stops oil. We're going to talk to Alex de Koning from Just Stop Oil on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And on today's episode, we've got Alex de Koning from Just Stop Oil to talk about the climate protests that you've probably seen on TV or you've seen on your news feeds, whether it be on Facebook, whether it be on Instagram, whether it be on X or what was known as Twitter or Threads or even TikTok. I've seen them everywhere. YouTube as well. I've seen them everywhere. They make headlines. They make headlines, Just Stop Oil, when they go on right-wing TV programs in the UK to talk about what they're doing and debate and sometimes get a word edgewise in and other times no, but they make headlines. And so my question was, when I kept seeing this, was, is it effective? Are people actually changing their mind? Are people actually doing something? Once they see these protests, are they getting educated or are they just getting frustrated? That was the big question I had. So I had Alex come on the program to talk about the climate protest that Just Stop Oil does, talk about why he joined Just Stop Oil, even though he's a PhD scientist. He's a PhD student on climate science in particular. He goes into explaining that. He goes into explaining why he joined Just Stop Oil, why he thinks it's important, why he thinks it's a duty of his to be able to get arrested at these protests. And it was just great having him on. I learned a ton about climate activism and sort of the motives behind each of these protests and a lot of the misinformation that we get, whether it's said or even not said on social media and on TV programs about the organization, about what they're trying to do. So without further ado, here's Alex de Koning talking about Just Stop Oil and climate protests. Here's the interview. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Alex, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about climate activism?
Very much so. Thank you for having me on the show.
You bet. I am extremely excited to have you on. This is a podcast that I've been wanting to do for a long time. We have seen the organization that you represent, Just Stop Oil. We have seen the protests online. We have seen the debates on UK television. It's been very interesting. There have been sort of like two sides to sort of the perception of Just Stop Oil, one positive, one negative, but it's also on the cusp of a very intense summer from a climate change perspective. We've seen wildfires all across the world. We've seen, and devastating ones, of course. We've seen massive hurricanes. We've seen massive typhoons. We've seen flooding. We've seen droughts. We've seen the whole preface of consequences that scientists and activists have been talking about for decades that will happen. We're actually seeing it happen. And it's becoming really, really scary. People are getting anxious. People want answers. People want change. And so having an organization like Just Stop Oil is kind of, in a way, good timing to really help people understand and really drive that change. But it's been a very interesting way of doing things in terms of the types of protests, in terms of sort of the debates. And I'm always curious from a scientist and ocean conservation perspective about activism, about the way we go and how effective protests, the certain protests that the Just Stop Oil is participating in, how effective it is in changing government's perspective. So we're going to get into all that. But before we do, Alex, can you just give us the audience an idea of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, great. Yes, I'm Alex. I'm a 25-year-old PhD climate scientist. I'm studying green hydrogen production in particular. I've been involved with Just Stop Oil for about a year and a half now. In March of 2022, I went to a talk. I had nothing to do that day. I was wearing headphones. It was great weather. I grabbed a flyer that said, "Find out what the youth are doing about the climate crisis." And that's exactly the reason why I became a scientist. I've always wanted to be a writer, to be honest. But I became a scientist because I was worried about the climate crisis ever since I was young. So I was really interested to see what other people were doing who weren't scientists, who wanted to do more than just recycling. I had no idea it would be about activism. And what I learned was shocking. Like, I had no idea the scale of the climate crisis, the urgency, because everybody knows about the climate crisis, but you don't really think about how it's going to affect food. You don't really think about the causes and the drivers of the climate crisis. You know about the solutions of renewables, but you don't really put two and two together of having needing to reduce our energy demand and how we can do so. What are the societal problems that are stopping us from making real change? So when I heard about what Just Stop Oil were planning to do in April, and when I was told about the history of civil resistance and how it's played such a huge part in getting every form of radical societal change that we've seen, really, I wanted to be involved. I knew I wanted to be on the right side of history. So I got involved, and just 2 weeks later, I ran in front of a moving oil tanker, sat down on the road for 14 hours and waited to get arrested. And then since then, I've been involved in lots of actions. I've been arrested 4 times. I've been on oil pipelines for 40 hours. I've been involved in, I think, over 50 national and international interviews. And I've been trying to do basically whatever I can in order to not only raise the alarm about the climate crisis, get people interested, and not only educate people as to what the actual villain is with the climate crisis, the oil and gas companies, but to put pressure on the government. And I'm very happy to tell you in a second about how the actions that Just Stop Oil are doing actually do pressurize the government, as opposed to just annoying the everyday public.
Yeah, and I think and that's what we want to get to, and we will definitely get to that. It's kind of interesting when you talk about how you got involved. Just passing by and seeing a flyer and being like, okay, it's a nice day, let's go see this talk. Obviously, you're already interested in climate. You said you've always wanted to be involved in climate. When you were younger, elementary school, middle school, high school, and even in university, what was your experience in learning about the climate? Was it involved in class? Was it from your parents, friends? Where did you get your information, and what type of information did you get about climate change and the climate crisis?
That's a really good question. My earliest memory about it is I was 9 years old, and it was in primary school. We were doing a study about the Amazon rainforest, and I love animals. Animals in space at the time were my 2 big passions. I always wanted to be a zoologist or something along those lines. So I was so excited about this Amazon rainforest project. I studied about it for so long, and then I found out about deforestation and about how the Amazon was being destroyed. And it shocked me as to how that could happen. And then I asked my parents about it, which led to more and more research. And then I found out about the climate crisis. And about how droughts and wildfires and sea level rise was just going to become more and more commonplace, how diseases are going to spread. And I was so shocked as like a 9-10-year-old boy that nobody was really talking about it in the same sense. We just kept going on, business as usual. Like this big extinction level threat is just happening at some point in the future. And yet we just continue on. So what I was always told growing up, like through class, through the media, is that yes, we all know the climate crisis is a threat, and we're doing what we can. The solutions just aren't there yet. But when they do become there, we'll switch over to renewables. The problem will be solved. There shouldn't really be too much need for alarm. And then recently, when I've been finding out more and more about how the solutions are not only so viable and cheaper now than fossil fuels ever were, the fact that governments and oil and gas companies are deliberately making it so much harder to have climate action, not even like ignoring the solutions, but deliberately making them more difficult. We still have a ban in the UK of onshore wind, the cheapest form of energy there is. And we can't build onshore wind farms. It's ridiculous to me that we're still at this stage when we've seen the summer that we have seen, that governments are still refusing to act. And I think that's a large part because of the corruption. So, for example, Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, has just approved 100 new oil and gas licenses. This is the demand of Just Stop Oil, that they would not approve these new oil and gas licenses for exploration in the North Sea. But he completely ignored a year and a half of campaigning and went ahead with it anyway. And then it was revealed a couple of days later that just the month before, his family firm made a £1.5 billion deal with BP. And a couple of years before that, they made a £1 billion deal with Shell. So it's becoming so blatant that our government care far more about their own family money's pockets than they do about us.
How is he still the prime minister if that comes out?
It's a really good question.
Like
it's still legal. It's still legal for his family firm to make a deal with BP.
So here this is what I don't understand. And I'm sure you share the frustration over this whole thing. I'm just learning like this news now. You have a prime minister who his government approves 100 new licenses for oil and gas development. Mm-hmm. That same prime minister a year ago the family's firm made a deal with Shell, a $1 billion deal to work with Shell. Then just recently, a $1.5 billion deal with, you said BP, right? BP. And then all of a sudden you get this approval.
Yeah.
It's a direct link. You'd have to be an idiot not to see this direct link of conflict of interest. And did anybody ask from the opposition for him to resign based on this?
Not really, to be honest. Our opposition party, Labour, and the head of that is Sir Keir Starmer, is quite weak. They've included it in their manifesto that they want no new oil and gas, in the same way that Just Stop Oil wants no new oil and gas. But they're so determined to get into office that they are not putting up a fuss about these things. They're still going to let the Conservative government, our current government, push through all of their oil and gas licenses so far, and they're not going to revoke any of them if and when they do come into office. So they're letting the Conservatives do all the dirty work, and then when they get into office, they go, oh, well, we have enough oil and gas licenses now, we don't need any more.
Unbelievable. That is not now I know why you're protesting getting arrested, because like this is getting ridiculous. Yeah, that's absolutely infuriating to hear that news, and you can see the corruption. And something that I've seen in North America recently, and I covered this story on the podcast just to share it with you. I don't know if you already know this, but so a lot of the solar panel, I guess solar farms and solar industry, a lot of it's based in California, right? Mm-hmm. And because the policies allow for it to happen, they get rebates, they get tax breaks and things like that. But it's getting a lot harder to start new solar projects it's expensive in California. And so like you have to buy land and that's expensive and so forth. So a lot of the solar companies are looking at the state of Texas, which is a Republican dominated state. And they're looking at Texas like, actually, there's a lot of deregulation in Texas. And there's some desert in Texas and a lot of land to put solar panels on. So now they're starting to move into Texas, understanding that there's less regulation and that they can put in solar panels easier and it's less expensive. So they're starting to move in. Well, the government here have proposed a bill, or the government in Texas have proposed a bill to stop the solar panel company from moving in. I think it's making it harder. They have to pay certain taxes and like making it harder essentially to set up shop and put out solar panels there. And that's of course backed by someone who is backed by oil and gas, and it's a frustrating thing. It's like you see it there. It's like a competition thing. It's like we see that these solar panel companies are going to come in. They're going to do what's right. They're going to they're going to make energy renewable. It's going to be cheaper. It's going to be easier to set up, and then we're going to get less of our share of the market, and we don't want that to happen. We want to keep our money. We want to continue to do that. So that's what's happening in Texas and in the States. And so you just see this, and it makes you wonder, like, how are our politicians allowed to be bought? Because that's essentially what they are. They get donations to their campaigns from super PACs and so forth, and their oil and gas money, a lot of them, because they lobby well. They know how to run things. And of course, there's PR. There have been PR documents that have been leaked here in Canada about how the oil and gas companies and the fossil fuel industry has changed the narrative around climate change, where here they're saying, oh, well, climate change is so far gone. Like we're so far into it. There's no point in doing anything about it. So just keep going on with the way it is. That's their plan, but they do it in different ways. So they're engaging with influencers now. They're paying influencers to talk about Shell and to talk about gas and why it's so important, and about these reward programs and so forth, and younger people, because they know, they're smart. They know where to hit. They know what markets to hit. And of course that goes into, if you look at fossil fuels, as you know, it's embedded in everything, plastics and all sorts of things, right? And so the frustration is there, the corruption is there, now it's the time for the battle, because you never know what the politician's going to do, whatever side of the aisle they're on. You never know what they're going to do. So for Just Stop Oil, it's activism, it's civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. Now when you mentioned how you started, you jumped from, I got involved. Next thing you know, I'm getting arrested, 4 times in a year and a half. When you do a protest like that, you get involved in a protest knowing that you're going to get arrested. Mm-hmm. What's your mindset like going into it? Like, getting arrested is a pretty big deal. It could affect your career. It could affect, future, jobs and just life in general. Safety is a concern. From you who's actually been part of those demonstrations, you've been arrested. What's your mindset going into a protest where that's the goal, or that's the expectation? Yeah,
good question. So the first time is obviously very different from the other times, because you don't know what to expect. The whole thing about being arrested is this level of unknown. You don't know how long you're going to be in a cell for. You don't know how long you're going to be until the trial. You don't know whether or not you're going to be found guilty. You don't know what the charge is going to be, what penalty. So they deliberately tap into this fear of the unknown in order to try and deter people from doing crimes, basically, and doing these sort of protests as well. So going in, it is terrifying, because especially as a young person, you don't know how this is going to affect your career, as you say. But then you think about, if you look back on this 10 years time from now, and you see the state of the world, are you really going to be that upset that you got arrested and that you spent a day in a jail cell? Or are you going to be quite proud that you tried to do something, and that this at the time seemed like the best course of action that you could take? So I think about that all the time. I think about how I would like to be on the right side of history. I'd like to be able to look at my future child and say, I really tried to make a difference. And I was trying to inspire others to take the same level of action so that we could stop the upcoming catastrophes. But as a young straight white man, it's a very different experience getting arrested than it is for someone in the minority group, which is why largely we have a lot more white people in Just Stop Oil, because the prison system in the UK is institutionally homophobic and racist. But when you're actually in a cell, it's quite different from what you'd expect. You just have your one sort of bed, which is kind of like a gym mattress, and you get given a book. Well, you don't. If you ask for it, if you ask for a cup of tea, you can get that. It's Britain after all. You get a blanket, and then it's just a waiting game. It's just about not getting bored. You're stuck in a cell for 12 hours. You're usually so exhausted that you sleep for most of that time because you've been so stressed about doing the actual action and about being arrested. So overall, it's not been too bad, thankfully. I've been arrested 4 times and I've still not had a conviction, which I'm very happy with from one way or another.
Okay, and now you mentioned, looking back 10 years from now, from 10 years, and you mentioned, like, if I have kids, like, did I say I did everything to do that? Now you mentioned family. So how does your family look like currently? What are their thoughts on what you've been involved in?
So my dad is extremely supportive. He's a scientist as well, and we have very similar life outlook and politics. So he fully gets it. My mom is mostly just nervous about me, which I think is very understandable. Still wants me to go for the standard academic career and no hiccups, like constantly, like, instead of doing actions or getting involved, as mom was asking me about, like, have you thought about attending any conferences recently, that kind of thing. So I think I'm quite lucky in that. I have a lot of friends in Just Stop Oil whose parents are a lot less supportive, and I know how difficult that is to still, in spite of that, do all the actions that we're doing.
Yeah. Now you are doing a PhD. Can you just talk a little bit more about what your PhD is on? You mentioned it was greenhouse gases, right? And can you just talk a little bit more about the detail?
Yeah, of course. So my PhD specifically is looking at green hydrogen production. So green hydrogen is typically gotten through renewables. So let's say you have a solar panel that splits the water using electricity, and you get hydrogen, which you can then use potentially for hydrogen-powered cars, but that's not very effective yet, or for other things. Hydrogen in general, this is in of itself is a huge question about hydrogen because there's so many different parts of it. There's blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. I'll try and sum this up as quickly as I can. Blue hydrogen is being pushed by the fossil fuel companies, and it's a massive scam. Blue hydrogen is where you reform fossil fuels in order to make hydrogen and then pretend that it's green, but you're still using fossil fuels and you're still having pretty much the same amount of carbon emissions, if not even slightly higher. Green hydrogen is like 100% green, except that in most circumstances, if not all, it's better to use the electricity directly as opposed to using the electricity to then split water to then make hydrogen, if that makes sense. Green hydrogen is good for some things. It's for specific niches, like, for example, long-term energy storage. You can have energy storage for short-term, like with batteries or so on. But for the course of months, like seasonal changes, because in the summer you obviously get more solar power, in the winter you get less. So for seasonal changes, that leftover energy you can store as green hydrogen for the winter, which is quite a nice feature. So my PhD specifically is not getting green hydrogen from renewables, it's getting green hydrogen from biogas, which is the gas that's released from wastewater waste or food waste or landfill waste. And it's mostly methane, natural gas. And then if we reform that to make green hydrogen, then the emissions that would otherwise be released from food waste, for example, is hopefully being captured and then changed into something that's useful. So that's my
interesting.
This subsection of that I'm looking at. Feel free to edit as much of this out as you want, because I know I'm talking.
No, I love it. I'm super interested. I know the audience will be super interested too.
So the subsection I'm looking at is biogas has a lot of impurities, especially sulfur impurities, and that affects the catalyst and the process, and you have to remove it beforehand, and that's very expensive. So I'm looking at trying to make these catalysts more resilient to the sulfur, so that hopefully you don't have to remove it beforehand, and it can be released alongside the pure carbon dioxide stream, which can then be captured and stored, as opposed to it otherwise being released. Now, the note for all of this is that obviously the best thing you can do to stop food waste emissions is to stop having as much food waste. So a lot of my PhD, while I'm still glad that I'm doing it, and I can still say I'm doing climate science PhD on interviews, which I'm very happy about, a lot of it is not strictly necessary. Like, we have the solutions to the climate crisis. We just need to use them. So I think what I'm doing in Just Stop Oil is far more important, because what we're facing now is not a scientific problem. We're facing a societal problem, and that's the way we make change.
Absolutely. I mean, the science is there. We know, climate change is a problem. We know what the problems are. As you mentioned, we know the solutions. It's a matter of implementing the solutions from a government perspective, which is most of it. You can do individual perspectives as well, but really it's a government thing. And to get the government to change, it takes a while, and it takes badgering and protests and civil disobedience, it looks like, for climate change, because the fossil fuel companies are so entrenched within the governments. It doesn't matter what governments, they're so entrenched. I mean, here in Canada, our economy is based on fossil fuels and other natural resources. And so it becomes very difficult when, we start talking about renewables, or when, we're trying to, we've implemented a carbon tax, and it's probably one of the most hated taxes in our country, even though it's actually doing some good things. I still think I criticize our government for the transparency not being there in terms of where that carbon tax will go and what it will do for us. But a lot of one party in particular is using that as fuel to confuse things and muddy the waters, so to speak, in terms of what this carbon tax actually does. And so it gets to a point where, I can see where a lot of people are frustrated, and you get to the point where it's like, you have to capture the government's attention. And so the way Just Stop Oil has done it is through civil disobedient protests, sitting in front of shipping containers of oil and gas, and disrupting traffic, going on a F1 racetrack, which I think still to this day is quite dangerous and insane for people to do that. I don't agree with that. But it's to get, so what I want to know from my perspective, I'm always curious about is, one, what's the strategy around that? And then how effective is that in sort of your purpose of what you want to do? And that's getting the government to reduce or to stop their support of the fossil fuel industry, of oil and gas.
Okay, and this is a big question, so I'll do my best to do it as succinctly.
Take your time with it. Absolutely.
So social change theory is complicated, because it's very different from a lot of scientific studies where you don't have as many variables. You can focus on one control group at a time. With social change theory, it's not quite as simple as that. So the reason why we're doing this strategy that we're doing it, and you've seen like blocking roads, slow marching. The simple answer is this is a last resort. We've tried everything else. People in Just Stop Oil have been campaigning, with petitions, with marches. They've run for office. They've put up posters. We've done all the other things that we could have done, really. So we're looking at the history books and seeing that civil disobedience in similar kind of styles to what the civil rights movement did, what Gandhi did, what disabled activists in the UK in the 90s did in order to get free public transport access, what other social movements have done, such as the LGBTQ plus movement, is do this civil disobedience. So by putting pressure on the government in order to do more, it opens up the public conversation as well. So we have tried other tactics, such as blocking oil and gas directly. As I said, in April 2022, for the first 2 weeks of April, we blocked, I think it was 50% roughly of oil and gas in the southeast of England. It was a colossal effort, but it didn't make anywhere near as much news and media conversation as when two activists threw a tin of soup at a Van Gogh painting. That actually got more people talking about the climate crisis than when 33 million people got displaced from floods in Pakistan, which was a horrible, once in a generation disaster. Sadly, it's not going to be a once in our generation, but it's a once in a generation disaster that didn't get anywhere near the same levels of conversation, not just about the climate crisis, but about oil and gas and about what we can do about it. So that's one element of it. The second element is not just about getting media conversation, it's about going to the correct institutions. So by getting arrested through slow marching, you get to speak to all those police officers and you make them question, is it right to arrest someone who's protesting something so important by just slow marching in the street, as many other campaign groups have done? You then get your day in court, where you get to convince the judges and the lawyers, which is a huge influential part of society at the moment. You get interviews off the back of that, so you get to speak to the media directly and try and convince them. It puts pressure on the government through a lot of people asking, like, just stop oil, they're so annoying, when are you going to do something about them? So that they have to step up, and they have basically two choices. They can either go further into repression of protest rights, or they can give in to our demand. And the more they go further into repression of protest rights, and they basically take away a fundamental human right to criticize the government, the more obvious it is that what they're doing is wrong. A lot of what Just Stop Oil are doing through these strategies is highlighting the errors of politics, of the media. It's forcing people to make decisions. And it's having this direct balance of being confrontational, but not too confrontational. So it creates those dinner party conversations, those dinner party debates, where people actually get into the subject and they go, well, I don't think what Just Stop Oil are doing are right. But on the other hand, this is a big issue. So in terms of the effectiveness, Just Stop Oil has been really quite effective. It's the first time in UK history that oil and gas has had a majority negative opinion since we've started. Since we've started, we've also had major banks divesting from new oil and gas funding. We've had all countries in the UK, except for England, say that they will have no new oil and gas. We've had all major political parties, except for the current political party, say no new oil and gas. We've had, for the first time, a majority opinion saying that they would like more non-violent direct action on the climate crisis. Although people sort of shoot the messenger, they hate Just Stop Oil, the demand gets more and more heard. And once people realize the demand and how sensical it is, how no-brainer it is, then they get convinced on that. So they can still hate Just Stop Oil, but they get more and more convinced about the demand.
Now, here's a question. You talk about it, the other UK governments stopping, divesting their interest in oil and gas and no new projects. Did your organization have direct conversations with them, or was it more the pressure from the people that were having it, or was it just a matter of, your organization started protesting, but this government may be a little bit more progressive that was in power. They were planning on doing it anyway. How do you, as a scientist brain, for me, how do you measure that? It could have been because of our action, or was it direct where you had your organization had conversations with the government? Love to hear that.
So we have attempted to have conversations with the government. We've made it very clear that that's what we want, and they've still not gotten back to us after a year and a half. But what has changed, and you can actually visibly see this, is the number of people who say they no longer want new oil and gas has increased quite significantly since we started. And it's that public pressure that helps all those other things to happen. There's, since you're a scientist, there's a great study that's come out from Social Change Lab, which looks at when Just Stop Oil blocked motorways in the UK around the time of COP27. The number of people who said that they would join Friends of the Earth as a result of seeing those protests and blocking the motorway increased. This is called a radical flank effect. The fact that we're the radical flank and we push the conversation doesn't make people necessarily want to join us, but it makes people want to join more moderate environmental groups, which are still more radical than what they were used to. So it shifts that conversation. It shifts. It's called an Overton window. It shifts the Overton window.
Right. So having sort of let's just say for like a more extreme method of doing things like Just Stop Oil in terms of protesting and activism doesn't necessarily lead for people to join that organization, but they're saying, hey, you know what? They actually have a point, or I'm sick of the climate crisis as well. I would like to see something done. They may join another organization that's maybe a little bit more centered or, more there that fits their values or fits their sort of methodology, and they can join that. I did just pull up that article. Was that in December 2022?
Yes.
Just Stop Oil protesters are likely building support for moderate climate organizations, survey reveals. Mm-hmm. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to put that in the show notes so that our audience can read that as well, just as a reference. Cause that's what I was looking for, right? Is how does, cause what we get, and again, it's from our news feed that we get, we see those protests, and of course it's always the more popular videos. When you're on TikTok, you see the more popular that's served, like, hey, do you like this? And you start watching this and you see people angry at you. You see people yelling like in traffic. And I do. And what's interesting is when you mentioned, Alex, where a lot of you, what you'll do is as you engage with even citizens who are like yelling at you, like, do you want to know why we're doing this? Do you know about the climate crisis? Do you know about, fossil fuels and what they do in the oil and gas and all this? And you hear them say, no, I don't want to know, but you get that. You see, you're always calm, and you like everybody that I see on there, not just you. I haven't seen you on the videos, but I've seen other people on videos. They're always calm and they're always talking to the people in a very polite voice, which has got to be frustrating because somebody yelling at you, your heart must be racing at that point because you never know what people are going to do. That's how I see it, and I get worried for you guys. But it's interesting how you're always trying to have that conversation with anybody who's engaging with you during the protests, or even like you said after in the judicial system and in the maybe the prisons and things like that when you do get arrested. You mentioned that you've never been convicted. Mm. What is the reasoning behind that from like the judge or the lawyers in that respect? Is it you go to trial but the prosecution just says no, we're not gonna bother with this trial, or the judge says actually, you know what, you didn't really break the law, this is just a case of protest? What laws are they trying to convict you on, and how come you haven't, like, what are the reasons why you haven't been convicted?
So I've been quite lucky, and most of my arrests have been before and the new laws have been pushed through by the government in order to repress protest rights. But in general for me, it's been either the case has been dropped, there's so many people being arrested at the same time that they couldn't possibly put everybody through the legal system, which is already very backed up in the UK. So they drop a lot of the cases, which is fantastic. Or in some cases, the judge has just said, yes, they've done this, but it's not a major offense, and they were doing it for good reasons. So we're going to let them off. So in two of the cases I had, one was they were both, if you don't get arrested in the next 6 months, if you have good behavior, we're going to let you off. And the next one was, if you don't get arrested in the next 9 months, you have good behavior, we'll let you off.
Gotcha.
So that's sort of in general the way they do it. I think because it wasn't just Stop Oil, there was Extinction Rebellion beforehand. So they've been seeing more and more climate activists, just genuinely quite nice and ordinary people, going for the legal systems. And that is starting to change their opinions, their perspectives as well, which is huge. And if we get to the stage where that no judge will prosecute a climate activist, then we've won. Everybody will join.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I have to ask, because it's always in the back of my head, this F1 race protest.
Yeah.
When these protests happen and you plan them, or not just you, the organization, I mean, what's taken into account? Like, what's the rationale for sitting on a racetrack with these cars that are going extremely fast? It's dangerous to the drivers as well as the protesters. Thank God nobody got injured. But is safety discussed? And I'm not sure if you were involved in that or you heard about that. Like, what's the rationale in terms of like, okay, I'm going to go sit on a racetrack and try and disrupt it. Like, I understand why you did it because the amount of gas that's used and so forth, and all the oil companies that are involved, but that's a dangerous thing. So what's taken into account when these protests are planned, I guess is the question.
Decisions like this are definitely not taken lightly. It's not just, there's a sporting event coming up. I think it's the F1. Let's go do that. That's not how things work. It was heavily risk assessed. We knew exactly what we were doing. It was deliberately picked that one spot. So you have this huge stretch of road that you can see far down. So there's plenty of time for a Formula One driver to see you. Only, I think it was like a quarter of the road was actually taken up. And it wasn't
the full that I saw. It wasn't the full road. Yeah.
Yes. It's deliberately designed. And it was also on the first lap that it was done. So before they get fully into the swing of things, there was I think it was a 23-second window or something where it was predicted that when they would hear that there was Just Stop Oil activists going to be on the road to when they were coming up to that corner. So there was plenty of time for the Formula One drivers to know what was going on. So this doesnst mean that I am in full support of every action that Just Stop Oil does, but I fully understand why they did it, and I'm very glad that it was risk assessed as thoroughly as it was. In the end, that got huge international coverage for 5 people being on a Formula One track for 7 seconds.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that is true. You do definitely get a lot of press on that. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, okay. Now they're really upping a notch when it comes to a protest. So I'm glad that it is taken into consideration. Obviously, safety for me is like a huge thing when it comes. It doesn't matter if you're doing science or field work or protests. It's a big thing, and you worry about both the drivers as well as the and the staff of the organization. So that's always helpful. Now, we talked a little bit about the arrests and you never know what's going to happen. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It happened recently in the U.S. There was, and I don't know if you know of the organization. I'm not saying it wasn't Just Stop Oil from my understanding, because it happened in the U.S. But there were climate activists that were protesting I guess it's a festival. It's Burning Man, which is in the desert in Nevada. And they had a barricade. And it was basically one road in, or at least one road in, where they stopped people for hours for like a couple of miles, back. And, there were videos that came out after the incident where, people were complaining that they're running out of water, they're running out of gas, and they just want to go. And the protest was, there's a lot of people who take private jets to go there. And of course, the event itself has a lot of plastic and a lot of fossil fuel based products and so forth. So they were protesting that. So they had a barricade. And at one point in the videos that were circulated, a ranger for Nevada, which is a police officer, had a pickup truck and literally drove right through the barricade. People were handcuffed to whatever the barricade was used. I think it was a trailer and so forth. And it just kind of like pushed right through. Very dangerous. And then he got out, he turned around. And at one point in his megaphone, he said, "You better move," and went through it again. Got out of his car, drew his gun at the protester, told her to get down. And the way she was handled was, I would say, violent. Obviously they were just said, "We're just peaceful protesters. We're just peaceful protesters." And he looked like he had lost his patience beyond of what a police officer should, in my opinion. I don't know if there's any charges. I haven't heard anything from it. A very dangerous situation. Were you aware? Was Just Stop Oil aware of that incident? Obviously, it has nothing to do with Just Stop Oil, but climate activists. And is the organization worried that police officers or anybody else would have a similar reaction to protests?
So I did hear about this outside of Just Stop Oil. I just saw it on my social media. Horrible that would happen. Mm-hmm. And I think it's I would hate to be a climate activist in the US. Terrifying.
But I guess it's a different culture, obviously, with police in the UK and as well as in the US. From what I've seen in terms of the arrests in the UK on the videos, they seem pretty like they know what they're doing. They kind of take you guys kind of know too, you're going to get arrested at some point. They take you out. Hopefully things are handled properly. But do you ever worry about, when you're in traffic and stuff, like people getting, like I've seen motorcycles go through the protests and things like that. Are you worried about that safety? Do you look out for each other, when you're in that type of protest for that type of behavior?
Of course we look out for each other. And we have non-violent training that everybody has to go through before they can do anything with Just Stop Oil. And it's a full day training because you're right. Like people do show extraordinary amounts of violence towards climate activists in these situations. We've had people shoving and assaulting Just Stop Oil protesters who are just slow marching in the road. They're only in the road for 15 minutes, walking slowly, maybe 20, 25 minutes. But that's enough for somebody to throw a punch at them. It's terrifying to show sort of the violence that people will get to so quickly. But there has also been success stories from this. Like, for example, there's been 2 or 3 instances where somebody, was dragging one of the Just Stop Oil protesters out the road, and then they come back the day after, apologize, and they go, well, I actually looked you up. I know why you're doing it. Fair play to you. So it's there's been such an atmosphere of hate that's been created by the British media, and I'm sure the American media as well, about climate activists are blocking ambulances, which is just not true. We've never blocked an ambulance before. We have a strict blue lights policy. They're risking people's lives. And it, especially for the right-wing news, it riles people up, and they portray the people who assault climate activists as heroes, and they portray climate activists as villains. So the media, I think, is the large part to blame in this, and that's what causes things like this. And I think doing actions like this in the face of that, it also highlights how broken as a society we've become, that we would resort to violence against a complete stranger after 10-minute traffic delay. And it shows that the media, where their true intentions lie. And it, in a way, it does rile people to action. It's horrible to say, but like a lot of the major turning points in different social movements have been as a result of them seeing people seeing injustice and going, well, I don't agree with what they're doing, but that's not on, so I will get involved. So it's horrible that for most people, that's what it takes for them to finally get involved in action.
Yeah, true. And you mentioned something interesting that I didn't realize, because it's never really mentioned in any of the videos, is the slow march protests are only done for a certain amount of time, 10, 15, 25 minutes. Mm-hmm. That's not, like, I understand people in traffic getting angry and getting impatient by that, but that's really not that long of a time. I thought this was going on, like you would just do it from, 7 o'clock and then go till 9 o'clock until rush hour is pretty much over, and then allow people to pass. Having that's a big piece of information that we don't get, in these short TikTok videos or Instagram videos or YouTube shorts or even YouTube videos. And I think that's an important aspect of the protest. They're timed and they're done appropriately. So I think that's really interesting. The other thing I want to bring up too is how it's interesting how we don't get that information in terms of, 10 minutes slow, like a short protest, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But the other thing you mentioned too, and I think that's really important for people to note.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry, go ahead.
There has obviously been protests that have been much longer. We have blocked traffic for hours in the past. But recently, our strategy has been to slow march every single day for 13 weeks, except for Sundays. To be there for just 15, 20, 25, 30 minutes at a time. And generally, it's however long the police allow us to be there. They will determine whether or not it's serious disruption. If it passes that threshold, which is never clear, then they will move us off the road immediately. And that's fine. And then we go off the road. So sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 20 minutes, sometimes it's 40 minutes, but it's never a long time. And it's always a handful of roads at any one time. I'm always trying in my interviews to try and show the perspective. There are 60,000 streets in London. We block a handful of them at a time for about 20, 25 minutes. In the meantime, in Canada, imagine the horrific wildfires and how many people's lives were affected, how many trees were destroyed, how many roads were blocked, how many people couldn't get to work because of the smoke that traveled down to America. And yet that's what the media focuses on. And I think by doing actions like this, it highlights where the priorities of the media and the government are really at.
Absolutely. And we talk about the media quite a bit here. You've had media training. You've been on some, the ones that I've seen, you've been on a popular network. And I'm not sure what the network is called, but the show is called Talk TV. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the network, Talk TV.
Oh, Talk TV. Okay. Now there's a famous guy who's on there who can infuriate people. Piers Morgan. He came to the States for a while and had a show on CNN. Very anti-gun was the time when he was here, and then he went back to the UK, and he's had some pretty interesting rants and pretty interesting perspectives. In terms of other subject matters, the royal family, Trump, and so forth. But he's had climate activists on the show. And I don't know if all of them have been Just Stop Oil, but I know you've been on the show before. And it's been like a very heated debate. He cuts people off. He kind of, in my opinion, tries to simplify things, like in terms of like it's either this or this, or like different, like one or two there's only one or the other as an option. It's black or white. What was the reasoning for Just Stop Oil to go on his show and try and sort of plead your case from what you're trying to do and how it's trying to react?
Yeah, you're right. Shows like this, you can barely get a word in edgeways. And it's also the audience who are going to be watching it are all extremely right-wing, of course, but it's still important to be on these shows to try and change the conversation. Because the people who watch this, they'll be in this bubble of only seeing right-wing news, and any sort of sense of reason and any different opinion you can try and push through will eventually make a huge difference. Before, the conversation in right-wing media in the UK was always whether or not climate change was real, whether or not climate change was man-made. Now the conversation is all about, well, yes, the climate crisis is very serious, but it's bad for the economy. We still need oil and gas. And just being able to shift those conversations, it makes a huge difference already. And it also creates moments on social media which can help go viral, can help inspire people into doing action. And that cannot be underestimated as well. So I think it's really important to show that we're all in this together, and that even the people who watch Talk TV or GB News, they're still a part of this too. And we need to try and make sure that everybody is as close to the same page as possible. So that we can continue on.
Have you had anybody approach the organization maybe as like from an audience perspective of, say, Talk TV as an example, and and have a discussion with the organization, say, I saw you on Talk TV and, I agree with you or I disagree with you, or have a conversation about it. Have you had any of that engagement from those shows?
A lot of it is the producers, actually, which is quite interesting. Like, I went to one GB News interview in person, and one of the producers afterwards pulled me aside and go, like, that was really amazing. My dad was a farmer, and his crops were literally being burnt in the field, and we never talk about these things. Thank you for doing that. So a lot of the producers who work on these right-wing shows are doing it because they just want a job. They don't necessarily have their politics aligned with that. So it's about really trying to bring the message and show the injustice, show the craziness to as many people as possible, because you never know who's going to be listening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting perspective. Now, I just before we jumped on this interview, I was watching one of the videos. It was about 2 weeks ago on Talk TV. It was on Piers Morgan's show, but he was away on vacation, you mentioned, and there was a different host. And it seemed as though the conversation was very different. It wasn't as combative. You got to say all your words without being interrupted, which was kind of nice. There was somebody from there was somebody from Net Zero, which I think is another environmental organization. I'm not familiar with them.
It's Net Zero Watch. They're a right-wing think tank who say net zero is going to kill us all faster than the climate crisis. So he's the opposite.
Okay.
It was nice for a change that he was the only one on that side, really. He was the one that was outnumbered, and not the people who are thinking that the climate crisis is one of the biggest threats that humanity's ever faced.
Right. And even the host, when she introduced the topic, she put a lot of facts that were right. And you even made a comment. You're like, wow, it was really nice to hear someone speak like true facts, from this, instead of like, I feel like Piers Morgan just gets into the here and now type of thing. Like the fact that you're, disrupting traffic. How dare you, how dare you get involved in the people's lives, and that, and not focusing on the bigger picture. This host seemed to focus on the bigger picture and sees value in that. It was just very nice to have that conversation where it wasn't combative, it wasn't simple-minded. It seemed like a very intellectual conversation for that show, and it was nice that you got to say your part in it. And so I guess it's another reason to go on those shows, because you never know when somebody's going to take vacation and you get your words in edgewise, right?
Yeah, I wish Piers Morgan would take more vacations.
He needs some rest. He needs some vacations.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think that really does show like of just how far the conversation can shift, even on these right wing shows. It's just like when the interviewer, for example, has something that really emotionally connects with them in terms of the climate crisis. Like one of their favorite holiday destinations has suddenly had a huge wildfire and affected a lot of people. It really resonates with them, and it makes them reconsider everything that they've heard about the climate crisis. It makes them reconsider how they want to present this next interview, how they want to present this next segment. So I think it's so important that we're having these kind of conversations and laying that foundation, so that the next time they see a huge flood or a huge wildfire, they don't think, oh God, what a disaster. It's a shame though these things happen. They think, this was caused by oil and gas companies who are just trying to get profit, even though renewable energies are cheaper.
Yeah, it's true. That's it's good to have that perspective and be able to say that perspective as well on that. So this has been fantastic to get sort of the idea and the strategy, and then the results that you've seen, for Just Stop Oil and the protests, and how it's put pressure and allowed people to develop ideas and thoughts on the climate crisis, and do whatever they need to do to help it. What's in the future for Just Stop Oil? I know it's a young organization. What's like? Are things going to change? Is it going to go sort of status quo in terms of the strategy? What can we look forward to seeing?
Well, we in Just Stop Oil have always said that as soon as the government end these new oil and gas licenses, as soon as they start taking the climate crisis seriously, then we'll all go home. There'll be no more disruption. And I do hope that happens soon and I can get back to my PhD, but I doubt it, if I'm honest. So yeah, we will continue doing these kind of slow marches and continue trying to target the government. I think we'll have a lot more actions that target the government themselves because there's never been a more important time. In the words of Kim Stanley Robinson, the future is not cast into one inevitable course. On the contrary, we can either have the sixth great mass extinction in the Earth's history, or we can create a beautiful civilization prosperous over the long haul. And that really resonates with me. Like, we're at such a critical moment. We can either, face all the horrible things that we're going to face in our current frame of mind, and still be terrible on migrants and whatnot, or this is a chance to try and create a better world. Have cleaner air, have public transport freely available. And these are all things that a lot of people deep down want to see. More income equality. And that's ultimately what we in Just Stop Oil and all climate activists are fighting for. Because we're trying to create a better world. And if that's not worth putting your money, putting your time, putting your body on the line for, then what is?
Totally agree with you. I think that's a really, really interesting perspective and great words said. I agree with you in terms of, climate crisis and things need to be done. The government needs to be held accountable. The prime minister needs to be held accountable for this conflict of interest issue. We had the same thing happen here, not the same thing, but something interesting happened here. Housing is a big problem in Ontario, like the province that I live in. The premier of Ontario decided to build houses, but in our green belt. So the area that we've had, like near Toronto, just north of Toronto, that we've protected because we need to protect it as a way to increase biodiversity, to kind of keep our systems and our habitats proper and our water running properly and everything. He's decided to take a few thousand hectares or acres and carve that out for housing. It just so happens that the developers who got the contract were developers that were at his daughter's wedding and that are friends of the family. And it was a $8.3 billion contract. So people are wondering, like, first of all, why did you go after the green belt? You told us at the beginning when you were running, you weren't going for the green belt. There are other areas that you can build. And then it came out that the government was at fault for this. And there was definitely a clear violation of conflict of interest, and the premier still won't take accountability for it. And it's just super frustrating where you're just like, this is a scandal that 10, 20 years ago, the premier or whoever was involved would have been ousted. They would have had to resign because of the scandal. And it seems like now it's just like, no, that's not a scandal. I don't think it is. I'm going to continue. And I just don't understand how that happens. I don't get it. People are like these politicians are making decisions for us, benefiting their family and their friends, and they're destroying our environment while doing it. And it's got to stop. The accountability has to be there. I don't care if they violated ethics or they censure them. It's like, no, you got to go. If somebody did this in a private business, you'd be fired. Go. Like, you step down. You took your position for granted. You took advantage of that, and now you got to go. And I just don't understand why that doesn't happen. I don't care what side of the aisle you are, what party you are. If you screw up, you got to go. That's as simple as it is. But apparently that doesn't happen anymore. So we'll have to see. Hopefully that will come back. And hopefully we see some government accountability in the future. But Alex, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast, taking the time to explain the strategies involved in the protests, the results from those protests, and some successes that you've had. I wish you safety for everybody in the organization. Good luck on the rest of your PhD if you're able to continue to do that during this time. I know it's a very busy time. But again, just thank you so much for explaining everything to us and to me. I think we definitely have a different perspective of Just Stop Oil. And good luck with your future endeavors. I'd love to have you back on to discuss more, and hopefully one day have you back on where it's like, hey, it worked. be stopped.
I very much hope so. It'd be my pleasure to come back on. Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex, for coming on the program and talking about Just Stop Oil, climate activism, the climate protests that you have not only participated in, but your organization has put out and participated in as well. I think it was really interesting to get Alex's point of view. I think I learned a ton of information from that interview about the effectiveness of climate activism, getting people to see what's happening and getting people to say, hey, I thought that was really interesting, that study, which I'll link to in the show notes, but getting people to see the protest and say, I may not want to do that, and I see their point, but I might support another organization that's more middle of the road. And I see a lot of opportunities for organizations who are middle of the road being able to still put policy in place and still put pressure on the government, but maybe not as extreme as getting arrested at a protest. People joining that, people saying, hey, you know what, this might be the thing. And I see an opportunity for those organizations to really put themselves out there and say, hey, you may not want to go to the extreme here, but and join Just Stop Oil, but we also believe in climate action and we want the government to do the same thing. And here's what we're doing, and you can support us in these types of fashions. I think there's the real opportunity to partnering with these organizations, collaborating with organizations like Just Stop Oil, and saying, hey, you know what, we can all, this is the betterment of climate. No matter where you're coming from, we can definitely play a role in this, as well as your role of getting all that attention. And I think one of the things that that Alex mentioned during the interview was the fact that, you know, when they did the museum protest where they splashed paint on a painting, or really on the covering of a painting, they didn't actually get the painting, the Mona Lisa it was, they got a lot of headlines. They got a ton of headlines, more headlines, and more people discussed that protest than the 33 million people that were displaced in the floods in Pakistan due to climate change. That tells you a lot, right? Where people are talking about a protest, maybe most of them are infuriated, but some of them are like, yeah, actually, we should be doing this. And this is where organizations can really come in. It's like, can you imagine we spent more time discussing that protest than we did discussing how we can prevent 33 million people getting displaced because of floods and rivers in Pakistan, right? It's really ironic how media works. And you know, these protests are not just done just out of, you know, because people want to do them. They're done with some strategy behind it, and they're done because it works. And I think that really helped me answer that question of, you know, are climate protests and climate activism, you know, are they beneficial? Do they work? Do they get what you want? And they're, you know, even though the UK government did approve 100 new licenses for oil and gas development, it's starting to work. We're starting to see people change their minds. The pressure is from the people on the government. That's where the real pressure comes from. And when it comes for election time, you know, that's gonna really help. However, we still need to pressure the government as much as possible. It doesn't matter what government you're from. You know, if you're in a democratic society and the government is supposed to listen to you, it's good to make sure that they hear your voice. Even if they're doing something, they still need to be doing more. We all know that. You know, no matter what good intentions the government has, we still need to do more, and we need to make sure that the government make sure they know that your elected officials know that. So that's the episode for today. I'm going to put links to some of the things that we discussed, that article that we discussed, that Alex and I discussed in the show notes, as well as links to the social media for Just Stop Oil, as well as their website. And if you have any comments or questions, I would love to hear them. Just DM me at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. If you want to contact me through email, go to speakupforblue.com and go to the Contact Us page, fill out the form. That goes right to my email. I will answer you as soon as I can. But I want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.